Um, the, thanks very much, and thanks to Joe again for the invitation, and particularly not actually withdrawing the offer to speak when I got to come back up here. I'm sure there's a load of people down in Marion Street at the moment in the department worried about what I am going to say in terms of advice. So for all of my former colleagues, I'll just wave to the camera there and say hello to them. I guess, you know, the important thing, I suppose, that I did in preparation for this was that I actually have spent the last 2 or 3 days at another event I was thankfully not uninvited from, with the permanent secretaries of the UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and I think I've properly thought about inviting them all back next year to here, even though I won't be the host. But that was because I had this fear that I might drift too much away from being a Secretary General of the Department of Finance, so there was nothing better to do than spend the last sort of 2 days talking about risks to the global economy by immersing myself with 4 real Secretary Generals of Departments of Finance. So I'm well up for this now in terms of frightening everybody about what's coming down the track and worrying about it. This is actually my 3rd visit to Clancy's, and I've been delighted to it. And I sort of feel like I've done a sort of a bit of a trilogy in different phases of the economy as we've gone along. Rather than read this, because I'll bore you all, I'm going to sort of try and flip through it, and I'll find somebody, maybe Joe will do it, because the department probably won't do it for me anymore. Joe might actually find a way to publish this, and then people can have some of the detail of what we've written in the last couple of days. But in a way, I see the last, well, this being the 3rd year, and the different speeches that I made as really having sort of 3 different phases. The first one was clearly back in 2012, and it's not really that long ago, but when I read these back just to make sure I hadn't said anything really stupid in any of them, or that I should sort of just apologise for now as having really misled everybody, I laid out the challenges that were facing the economy at the time. And that was a time when, remember, we were facing potential breakup of the Eurozone. We were trying to figure out how to get out of a troika, and there was a real sense of doom and gloom around the place. And I got taken apart on subsequent events for actually sounding optimistic that day, and actually saying, but frankly, we were starting to see changes across Europe in terms of solidarity, some of the stuff that was going on renegotiating the programme. The investor flight from Ireland had started to reverse, and there really were, to me, some real reasons to be much more positive than people generally were then. When we got to sort of the following year, then I think we talked an awful lot more about what we were actually doing in terms of the economy and trying to get jobs, because that had become the most important thing once we'd gotten stability. And I sort of feel like now what we're at is we're at a 3rd phase, now that we started creating jobs, where we really need to make sure we don't slip backwards. We need to make sure that we actually do secure the prize that is sort of waiting there for us, which is a full economic recovery. I mean, we've got the euro breakup crisis off the table, we've exited the programme, and we're now seeing economic growth where it really does matter, actually, which is in creating jobs. Our borrowing rates are down, GDP growth level is up, we've got the employment growth that is beating anything else in percentage terms across Europe, and exports. And broadly speaking, a lot of the important indicators show confidence around things. So I think it's important that I would say that from my perspective, even as a former Secretary General, I do think that we have sort of very significantly turned a corner, but we need to make sure that we don't lose the prize. I think the other thing I'd like to say, particularly because I'm speaking on a personal basis tonight, and I would like for anyone that's in the room that's writing anything to make sure that the journalists do actually recognise that it is a sort of a personal rendition here. I also think that it's important that we don't just say that economic recovery is the path that we have to follow, and that we don't forget, and I know you've been talking about this, that alongside creating a modern economy, we also need to create a modern society. And really focus in on making sure that we have a properly tolerant society, and that we don't go back and, into some of the practices we would have had before, that we have a completely open society that actually encourages, coming back to the economic thing, an environment where the best economic minds of the world are actually willing to come and live here, and we don't lose the best of our own. As far as talking about risks, when I was asked to talk about risks, I thought this was a particularly good thing for me to talk about, because one of the things we've been trying to push in the department for the last 3 or 4 years is really the building up of a much better risk function. There wasn't a chief risk officer in the department, there now is. There wasn't a risk committee, there now is. So while we can talk about a lot of different types of risks, to me the most important message that I'd like to give people is that there now is at least a much more robust sort of extra line of defence in the department on top of the previous sort of risk analysis that was there. And people, I think, are now not afraid to ask the stupid questions, because the stupid questions are normally the important ones. The other thing I think that hopefully has changed is I remember back in the height of 2012 driving into the office, and somebody, probably one of Sean's colleagues, was asking a minister other than our own whether or not we were doing any contingency planning for a breakup of the euro and for Greece leaving. And of course, immediately the answer came back, no, we don't do that kind of thing because it will never happen. And I had to contact our press office straight away, and thankfully it was before there was a €1,000 fine for this, and using your mobile phone, and actually say, guys, somebody needs to get out there and say that at the department we contingency plan for everything, and we need to do that. And we had been doing it, as of course was often said later. But I think probably in terms of sort of, thinking about the contingencies, in terms of thinking about where we are, I still see quite a lot of risks on the horizon. I don't think we're out of this in any sort of out of the woods completely. And we need to be thinking about things that way as we think about some of the hard decisions that we're going to have to make in the next sort of 12 and 18 months. And I suppose the easiest way to say it is that we're now in an environment, I suppose it's only appropriate that I would see the best weather I've ever seen in Glenties in 3 trips. I wrote this 3 days ago, this piece, but so I didn't actually know what it was going to be like. But basically, just because we don't feel that there's a howling wind out there at the moment, doesn't mean that we should put down our tools and stop actually building a house that is actually capable of withstanding the storms when they come, because they inevitably will come. And I think it's important to remember we still have very high debt ratios. We still have a deficit that is adding on the burden of our children and our children's children in terms of adding to our debt. And we need to deal with those things. The rest of the speech that I had prepared, I'd really decided to sort of talk about the external environments and the internal risks, because that was sort of what was led by the programme. But I'm not going to spend too much on the internal risks, so don't get too worried that as I go through the external ones, I'm going to spend as long going through the internal ones, because I think we know them. I want to go back to sort of, the early 2000s and remind people that what exposed the fragility of our economy here was actually an event outside of Ireland. Lehman's did not cause our problem. It exposed our problems when international investors ran away from lots of different situations across the world looking for safety, and they ran away from Ireland in particular, and it exposed the weak sand on which we had tried to build an economy. And I think it's absolutely important that we understand and think about the external events and how they might change, or indeed what they're doing in respect of our current one. We have had some very good news on the international front. Right? We've got a global economy that is starting and looks like it will continue to have some growth. The very dangerous tail risks in the Eurozone are dissipating. The threat of the breakup has disappeared and gone off the table. And we have significant international sort of investor confidence in Ireland. I don't know if you remember that the first time I spoke to you, I had the pleasure of announcing our return to the international markets at the time. On that day, and we were borrowing at over 6% for an 8-year period, and that was only sort of 2 years ago. So you can see how much we've actually done it. I learned along the way in the last week that French rates, borrowing rates, were actually at their lowest, I'm told, by the source I have, since 46. Right? And that's not 1946, that's 1746. Right? So that will give you some sense of just how almost unnaturally low interest rates for sovereigns are across the world. Now, that presents an awful lot of opportunities, I think, for those sovereigns who have borrowing capacity, for them to actually beef up investment in infrastructure, because if you can't invest in infrastructure when you've got rates as low as that, if you've got the head capacity in your debt ceilings, and that you probably never will find a good reason to invest in good infrastructure. But things are also not working equally. The money transmission in the US is working very well. The Fed are putting in liquidity into the system. It's getting to the banks. It's getting to the economy. The credit is there and it's creating jobs. The same is not happening in Europe. We saw a vicious bank sovereign cycle. We're actually seeing the opposite side of that in some respects now, because as people get more comfortable about the banks and the sovereigns, they're both building on each other and getting better, and we know how good that is here in Ireland. But we're also seeing a fundamental switch of the way in which economies are being funded in Europe, where we're moving into non-bank funding as well. And so other lenders, thankfully, because the banking system in Europe is going to take a bit of time to get really working properly, other lenders are actually coming in, and we're seeing that here a lot in Ireland. But we're also seeing, and I'm going to talk about 5 particular international risks tonight that I want to do. Global economic growth is still lagging behind expectations. So the obvious first thing that causes a problem is that as we are an open, competing sort of economy trying to find people to buy our products, to the extent that they're not buying, we have the obvious problem. But we have a much more fundamentally difficult risk to analyse, which is that has meant that other monetary authorities, particularly in the US, have pumped loads of liquidity into the system. And they need to find a way to take that back out again. And guess what? The US is essentially ahead of the game in terms of the cycle for us. So they'll be doing that before Europe is ready. And you might say, well, it doesn't matter because it's all happening over there. But the best analysis I can sort of, have gone through is this is an uncharted sort of water, so we don't know really what will happen. But in the past, if you look at rates across sovereigns, when US rates go up by 100 basis points, German and French rates have gone up by about 70 basis points. There's a strong correlation between the two. And it's going to be a particular challenge for the ECB to try and keep down European rates, particularly, as I mentioned, that there are an awful lot of non-European funders of the European economy in play now for whom these US events will be much more real to do that. And that is going to present a big risk to us that interest rates actually start to rise, even before we're ready. And it sort of reminds me of the opposite side of, remember what happened back in the early 2000s when we had Germany and Ireland in 2 different places in terms of interest rate risk. We have potentially got that at a more macro level now. The other challenge I want to talk about is there's a sort of a problem when you've got an economy where, or indeed parts of the world, where some are deleveraging and some are needing to re-leverage. We have that in spades here in Ireland. We have banks that need to deleverage, but yet we want them to lend back out. So there's a very delicate sort of balance to try and get right when you're doing that. There are some households and businesses that need to deleverage, and yet we need to supply credit to others so that they can actually grow and keep going. We also have seen in the last while some unusual impacts in this re-leveraging side taking place across the globe. In the emerging market countries, there's an awful lot of cheap liquidity has been going into those, and in some countries like China in particular, there has been a lot of relatively unsafe lending, and they're trying to work that back out again. And it's at a relatively delicate stage. There's about 17%, I think, of companies in the emerging market countries are in sort of what you would call relatively delicate situations. If interest rates go up by about 25%, that 17% goes to 30% of companies now in over-indebted situations. And what happens if that occurs when it comes back across the rest of the global market will certainly have an impact in terms of where we are here. It's not just emerging markets. High-yield issuance has gone way up, but it's gone way up with lots of companies with very weak credits. But the rates are down. So there's now a fundamental divergence between sort of fundamentals that should be happening both at companies and at country level and the spreads that we're charging. They've dislocated in the last 3 years in ways that they haven't done for 10 years before that. And I think we need to be worried about what happens if a shock comes to the system and people suddenly wake up saying we're not being paid correctly for that, and what that will mean to us. Now, I don't think we're at a danger point at the moment by any stretch, but I do think we need to be conscious that this risk is bubbling around in the global system, and if it comes to land, we're going to see interest rates go up, which means that we should be on our bike trying to sort out the things we need to sort out here before that happens, so we're in the best position we can be in. The third risk is sort of somewhat interconnected with all this, which is what I'd like to call just complacency. The sort of the fatigue, we've got a reason to get out of it. We have to finish in Europe the job of actually reforming all the pieces we've got to do. Banking union has to be done. We have to do a proper stress test, and we have to sort of work out our own sort of situation here in Ireland. And we can do that with some flexibility. I think there's probably a growing consensus, which is good, that some flexibility, if we're going to be facing lower than expected growth rates, is the right way to do it, but it doesn't mean you necessarily stop. So the guys in Moran Street can be happy. I'm going to stay broadly on sort of, message. I haven't suddenly, gone off for a week to France and suddenly come back with completely different ideas. I still think we need to do that, and not just us. The Italians need to do it, the UK need to do it, and everywhere else to do that. And that's particularly important, again, because something else is going on in the markets that people may not notice, is that large amounts of the bonds, apart from those held by the public sector, are now held by money market funds and other investors. But the problem is that the dealer community that would typically have been able to trade these out for them are not holding the inventories that they used to do. So we have a lot less liquidity now in the bond markets, and therefore the shock, if it comes, could have a much more dramatic effect than we would have expected to have happened. The fourth risk I picked out when I was talking about is political risks, and we can go through these relatively quickly. We all are listening, sadly. It's come much closer to home than we would have ever hoped. The Ukrainian situation and the tensions there and what they may do to a number of things, including sort of European energy policy. The Middle East is not looking particularly stable at the moment. There are political decisions going across the world about taxation that have very direct impact here. Probably one of the most fundamental debates I've heard at policy level for a long time about how much tax should companies pay, how much should shareholders pay, and how do we split that up between countries. And much closer to home, the UK is going to be making some very important decisions in the next couple of years about its place in Europe and the impact of that. The last big risk that I picked from outside was this risk of deflation. And I probably would say that there, I think we've focused on it. The ECB are focused on it. They've done their measures. Let's hope it works. I think the Commission seem to be confident as they look at things that this will actually move. But I think it's important that we always remember that 2% is not a ceiling, it's only a target for the ECB. And the question I sort of asked myself is, would they be doing the same level of activity if we were at 3.5%? The same distance at the other side of the so-called target, or would they be much more aggressive at the moment? And I think they need to carefully watch this, and if necessary, consider substantial balance sheet expansion if we don't do it, because this is going to be a particular problem, and particularly so here in Ireland, where you've got high sort of levels of indebtedness, because if you're going to have sort of a rise in real interest rates, it's going to even be more difficult to work it out. On the domestic side, I think I probably have silenced everybody now. You all look like in a state of shock about all this. And the real message there is just, look, it's not plain sailing out there on the external world. So a lot of stuff is outside our control, and we just need to make sure that we have protected ourselves and worked through to put ourselves in as strong a position as we can. I think the other stuff I'm probably more benign about because it is within our own control. We can sort the problems out and in fact I actually mentioned all these in 2012, so you can just go back and read my speech. They're all there. The property sector, the weak construction sector, the high levels of indebtedness that we need to work out, which are actually working through the system, the high savings rates, which are coming down and people are starting to spend a bit more, and the banking sector, and there are people that will follow me that know much more about this than I will ever pretend to know, so I won't necessarily talk about it. There's one challenge, though, that I didn't quite pick up at the time that I think is key to the economic recovery, and one not necessarily talked about an awful lot, which is this concept of having small companies and growing companies that need to grow when you have a whole load of negative sort of, equity and houses around the country, because you are missing the equity part for investing and starting up those companies before you go to the bank looking for a loan. And I think we need to do a bit of thinking about the broader process of how we actually develop a domestic savings pool that can be invested into companies like this as equity. And in particular, and I suppose it's not, I don't think, giving a breach of any confidences, if I say that over the last year I've been particularly focused on this whole area and focusing on this, and I've been very disappointed by the number of submissions that I kept getting as Secretary General, where the main solution I was given every time was we need to give people tax relief for actually investing in companies. It just seems to me that that is missing the point. If you invest in a company, you take equity, you take risk, you should get rewarded. You shouldn't be asking everybody else in the room here to protect you against a chunk of that risk. And there's a kind of a fundamental underlying concern there that I have, that we as a sort of a nation of savers have probably been too scarred by what we went through in the crisis to be back ready, mature enough, ready to invest without feeling like we have actually got coverage from somebody else. And yet, the very problem we had, it seemed to me, was caused very significantly by things like Section 23 schemes that meant people didn't necessarily care as much about the fundamental values of the properties they were buying. And I would prefer to see a situation where if we can encourage people, as we should, to invest in companies and put in this necessary equity, they should be at risk for the first euro and they should be getting all the upside, because then what you'll find is they'll actually manage the company and they'll make sure the company is in better shape when they're investing into it. And so I think there's a big thing there to be worked out. Competitivity and competitiveness of the economy, you'll all know where I would be on that one as to what we need to do. And I suppose the last risk, which again is a new risk that has probably come more to the fore for everyone else, and I will finish on this one, Sean, if that's okay, is the social cohesion issues and the need to make sure that we manage through the rest of the next couple of years with proper cohesion in terms of what we're doing. And a lot of debate has taken place. We have a big youth unemployment situation to solve all the way across Europe, and we need to make sure that we find solutions for that quickly, because that will tear the heart out of society. And I think the last social cohesion issue that I think is now getting very much an appropriate attention is this issue of inequality and the way in which the top part of society are getting richer way more fast than the lower elements are actually, participating in the economic recovery. And that is particularly so, frankly, in those areas of sort of low-skilled workers across. And if you look at the numbers, you'll see a lot of masking of the numbers when you look at it on a global level, because actually those cohorts are doing very well in Asia, in Africa, and indeed women seem to be doing well, but that's just because of greater participation. Whereas in reality, actually, they're slipping further and further behind. And education will solve the problem for us over the longer term. But I think in the next couple of years, we need to think about some sort of, good measures in our various budgets to actually deal with that one in the short term. So I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I ran over a little bit, Sean. But hopefully I've spurred some thoughts for the rest of the panel as well. Thanks very much.